Thank you all for coming to this opening session. I don't know whether it's better to be first or last. We'll see what happens over the next couple of days. But let's go to right. Well, I'm a humanities person. I was trained in disciplines of textual analysis and aesthetic appreciation, but of course the grass always looks greener on the other side, and so I've tried to educate myself in some of the important aspects of economics that have undergirded the modern account of innovation. I've done this because, as I argued in my book, Hidden Innovation, Policy, Industry and the Creative Sector, that the innovation framework offers the best opportunity in decades to reassess and refresh the case for the public role of the humanities, particularly the media, cultural and communications disciplines. Now, of course, I didn't do this unaided. For a considerable chunk of time, from 2005 to 2014, I directed a national research centre of excellence in creative industries and innovation, the purpose of which, amongst other things, was to forge strong cross-disciplinary links in order to address significant national issues and opportunities. And for that, because of that, I was able to reach beyond the usual disciplinary silos and benefited greatly from working with evolutionary economists in exploring the implications of non-equilibrium economic thinking for screen media and culture. Now, of course, Central and Northern Europe has been a home and haven for evolutionary economics, and many colleagues here today will be far more finely tutored in that discipline than me. What motivated my colleagues, Terry Flew and Adam Swift and I, to write our little book, Media Economics, which came out in 2015, was the increasingly sterile standoff and predictable potshots in academic media and communication studies between the default settings established by critical political economy and those few economists, largely neoclassical, who engage professionally with media. There was a certain lack of intellectual curiosity and disciplinary siloisation that meant that neither tired paradigm was making a sufficient fist of coming to terms with the new dynamics of media production and consumption. And so we identified, I suppose, in that book, some key ones, and you'll know them all very well. The generalisation of the convergent media condition, the growing interest in the socio-economic value of networks, and I'll have a little bit more to say about that in a minute, business model disruption, the marketisation of vernacular creativity, and I'll also come back to that, the reconceptualisation of media audiences, especially millennial media audiences, who've been a generation lost to linear broadcasting and print media, and who in significant numbers respond positively to calls for action and other forms of heightened interactivity and engagement. And finally, the services industry's innovation claims that have grown around the creative industries. So Terry, Adam and I take an institutional and evolutionary economics, take those sub-disciplines for a drive around this terrain and see how they perform. We're non-dogmatic about what institutional and evolutionary economics can do to spruce up media studies. We argue that they offer fresh perspectives on our current media landscapes, because of course it would be quixotic to do so, supplanting neoclassical and critical political economy. The importance of both an attention to the evolutionary longue durée against which the present needs to be measured and a rigorous Schumpeterian innovation approach is exemplified in Robin Mansell's colleague at the London School of Economics, Gerben Bakker. And Gerben's work that starts with his PhD thesis that became this book, Entertainment Industrialised, and continuing on, has been a very important area of work, I think. Now, for Bakker, motion pictures constituted a revolutionary new technology that transformed entertainment, which was a rival, labour-intensive service, into a non-rival commodity. He combined growth accounting with a new output concept and showed that productivity growth in entertainment surpassed that in any manufacturing industry between 1900 and 1938. Productivity growth in personal services was not stagnant by definition as current understandings, and they continue today, but instead was unparalleled in some cases. Motion pictures' contribution to aggregate GDP and total factor productivity growth was much smaller than that of general purpose technologies like steam railways and electricity, but nevertheless was very significant. So he echoes Robert Solow in saying that motion pictures are everywhere except in the productivity statistics. Pointing to Bakker allows me to propose that creative industries in their 20th century industrialising forms and now in their 21st century digitised forms may have played a much greater role in structural change in the economy than any economist has given them credit for. Why is there so little work like Bakker's around? One of the main reasons is that debates about cultural and creative industries have been constantly and probably constitutively confusing. This has been helped along by the constant focus on triple bottom lines, cultural, social, as well as economic value, which is of course completely understandable, but hedges bets all the time. As well, there are inherent limitations in both neoclassical economic cases for culture, based on market failure and moral appeals about underpaid artists, and the focus of critical political economy on very large, preferably multinational firms and their assumed capacity to exert untoward influence as captains of our consciousness. It is for this reason that Hassan Bakshi and I, Hassan at Nesta in the UK and I proposed recently to more rigorously distinguish between cultural policy and creative industries policy, at least separating out where culture and creativity, where appropriate, needs to be distinct. We argue that the time has come for the UK government to classify and publish statistics on the cultural sector alongside its existing highly regarded creative industries economic estimates. What is needed are official statistics which allow for both cultural and creative activity to be taken full account of, acknowledging both the substantial overlap between the two areas of activity, as well as dealing as best as possible with the well-known challenges that underestimate the extent of cultural activity, particularly, of course, the extent of voluntary activity. And we can talk about that in discussion or later, but I've done a lot of work in this area with the official statistics body, the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics in Australia. If government began to classify and publish statistics on the cultural sector and creative industries this way, it would lead to better and more transparent cultural and creative industries activity. It would also help to clarify that the cultural sector is supported by government mainly on cultural grounds, and that the creative industries are supported primarily because of their economic contribution. Both of these are equally important. By the way, don't try doing this necessarily in your own country. It might work in a jurisdiction that is engaged in depth with what creative industries bring to modern economies, and the UK certainly has done that, but it's certainly not something that I would try in Australia, where that depth of work is sadly lacking. But back to 21st century digital creative industries, and to an article which exemplifies the relation between evolutionary economics and cultural and media studies. In this article by Potts and Cunningham, Hartley and Ormerod, Social Network Markets, a new definition of the creative industries back in 2008. I want to say a few things about this. So here were two renegades from the land of literature, John Hartley and I, and two evolutionary economists swanning around in the Elysian fields of culture, Jason Potts and Paul Ormerod. And what did we come up with? Well, back then in 2008, 10 years ago, in what became a heavily cited paper, we posited that the creative industries are properly defined in terms of a class of economic choice theory in which the predominant fact is that because of inherent novelty and uncertainty, decisions to both produce and consume are largely determined by the choice of others in a social network. And of course, the choices of others have been built into economic calculus since Veblen, but the affordances or the network effects of digital networks scale such calculus to new heights. So this article was an attempt to move definitions of the creative industries away from concatenations of established industry sectors to a concept of an emergent market economy. Now, while it's a remarkable fact that many, if not most industries, started out as the hobbies or tinkering of enthusiastic amateurs or shunned obsessives, or through unpredicted breakthroughs, the liminal zone between the social and the market, not just in startup conditions, are the normal conditions of social network markets. These activities stay at the complex borderline between social networks and established markets. These complex social networks play at least as significant a coordination role as price signals, we argued. Creative industries' infamous radical uncertainty of demand that's been analysed by Art Devaney and Richard Caves and others is mitigated and managed better in social network markets, we argued. The policy implications of this definition move the attention from traditional cultural economics focus on market failure to a Schumpeterian focus on the apportionment of risk and uncertainty to the appropriate social domain best able to carry it. Also, it points to the development of institutions that facilitate experimental behaviour and accommodate the dynamic costs of change. Now, a major research challenge was to furnish evidence that the digitally enabled end of the creative industries is dynamically interdependent with high tech, and policy should focus not only on how new technologies affect the creative industries, but how creative industries may affect the adoption and retention of new technologies. When we first coined this term social network markets, back then 2007, 2008, we might have posited its existence, but at that time we only had to talk, all that we had to talk about were MySpace, Second Life, and YouTube in its just at the moment at which Google is buying it and turning it into something else. But we could hardly have dreamed of the scale and consequence of what was brewing. Over the less than 10 years since that paper was published, a new proto-industry has been born, which I have now completed a large book on with my collaborator David Craik at the University of Southern California, which is forthcoming from New York University Press, hopefully next year. Our book is called Social Media Entertainment. Social media entertainment, the new industry at the intersection of Hollywood and Silicon Valley. In this book, we explore how the emerging shape of screen industries in the 21st century shows how established players, principles and practices are ceding significant power and influence to powerful digital streaming and social networking platforms. Just as notably, these platforms and the native content they are facilitating, commissioning and generating represent a greater value proposition to the advertising industry that has served as the bulwark for main media since the start of broadcasting 100 years ago. Creators have harnessed these platforms to generate significantly different content, separate from the century-long model of intellectual property control and exploitation in the legacy content industries. This new screen ecology is driven by intrinsically interactive technologies and strategies of fan, viewer, audience and community engagement. Combined, these factors inform a qualitatively different globalization dynamic that is scaled with great velocity, posing new challenges for established screen companies, creatives, and regulatory regimes, not of course to mention media scholars. This emerging new screen ecology has given rise not only to major challenges to established media, but is being shaped by a set of newly prominent online screen entertainment platforms, of course most prominently Apple, Amazon and Netflix, but also and especially for our research in this book, Google, the owner of YouTube, along with Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and their Chinese counterparts, Weibo, WeChat, Youku, and their owners, the Bats. This industry is only a bit more than 10 years old, starting soon after the acquisition by Google of YouTube in 2006. By 2017, it sees more than 3 million YouTube creators globally receiving some level of remuneration from their uploaded content, and more than 4,000 YouTube professionalizing amateur channels with at least 1 million subscribers. The top 5,000 YouTube channels have received over 250 billion video views in aggregate. Now, it's important to stress the distinction between social media entertainment content and platforms and the Hollywood-like content distributed and in some cases increasingly produced by the major internet distributed television portals that Amanda Lotz calls them portals, such as Hulu, Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Apple's iTunes. While these portals largely specialize in mainstream long-form premium content supported by sophisticated algorithmic feedback, social media platforms, as distinct from portals, offer scale, reach, technological affordance, remuneration, and upskilling to previously amateur creators. David and I, in this book, argue that social media entertainment constitutes a more radical cultural and content challenge to established media than the digital streamers. It would be little overstatement to claim that these dynamics are a huge experiment in seeking to convert vernacular or informal creativity into talent and content increasingly attractive to advertisers, brands, talent agencies, studios and venture capital investors on a near global scale. And this has great implications for content and entertainment formats, production cultures, industry structures, and measurement of audience engagement. And that's what we do in this book, and inspired, I suppose, by Vanderbilt law Professor Stephen Hetch's statement that the world has never before seen the likes of YouTube in terms of the availability of non-infringing content. Now, I'm glad, because we probably wouldn't have the time, but this is Hank Green in the centre. He's I suppose the thought leader of this field of social media entertainment, or what we call social media entertainment. And there's a 3-minute video, but we can't get the audio going, so you're just going to have to put up with me, I'm afraid. But Hank and John Green, the Vlog brothers, were to be given some centre stage right now. So what are the implications for policy in all of this? As these social network markets, as we called them 10 years ago, exploded around the world in the last 7 to 10 years, and recognising that increasingly, especially young citizens, are engaged online, government and public cultural agencies have started to engage and have begun to shore up local capacity to participate in global online culture. So let me give you a few examples. In 2015, the Arts Council England recognised that it needed to assess the kind of contemporary art production it funded and take steps to make sure it reached where the audience are more likely to be. For this reason, it awarded £1.8 million to online distribution company Rightstar to deliver Canvas, an online digital arts hub or multi-channel network. Canvas is a program specifically not to make art, but to collate, curate and showcase content from UK leading arts organisations alongside original content. In Japan, YouTube partnered with Toei, a major Japanese producer and distributor of film and TV programs, in an initiative designed to help creators produce videos in the style of Japanese jitageki, or period drama. Google Canada and the Canadian Media Fund have partnered to develop a YouTube channel dedicated to showcasing original Canadian films. In the US, PBS Digital Studios reaches a community of gamers, filmmakers and other creators with over 50 original web series, from arts to sciences to lifestyle. And perhaps the biggest that we know of, at least, cultural subsidy shift in this field is the establishment of Funk, an annual 45 million euro investment in online content services for young viewers from the German public broadcasters ARD and ZDF. As far as we can ascertain, as I said, this is the largest public subvention of social media entertainment to this time. Okay, so that's all good, but what about regulation? Regulation, much more challenging, much more difficult than cultural subvention. In First Monday this year, Phil Napoli and Robin Kaplan have written a near definitive critique of the attempts by tech companies, obviously Google, Facebook, Twitter and so on, not to be regarded as, and therefore potentially regulated as, media companies. Napoli and Kaplan forensically examine the implications of these tech companies being treated as media companies. It's no mere semantic distinction, they say. They point to the increasingly dominant position that Facebook and Google have in both advertising revenue and in the marketplace of ideas. The fact that this has rarely sparked a conversation, quote unquote, in US policy discourse can at least in part be attributed to the success thus far of the tech company, not media company rhetoric. But these platforms, they say, inevitably evolve in ways that make the technology company, not media company, distinction even more invalid. For example, vertical integration into content creation and more interventionist curation, and we know all about those moves recently. They conclude with this open-ended challenge to policymakers and media scholars, you can see on the slide, to more rigorously delineate the contours and parameters of the contemporary hybrid media technology company. Now, Napoli and Kaplan may seem very late to the party for Europeans. In Europe, state and suprastate actors have moved beyond sparking a conversation, as they talk about, and they have acted to regulate and define substantially US platforms based on concerns about a wide array of their impacts and influence over the course of now almost a decade. Now, you'll know about all of these, and I won't go into detail about them. You'll know that France fined Facebook 150,000 euros for alleged privacy violations. Several other EU countries are investigating the company's privacy practices. Last year, the EU ordered Apple to pay 13 billion euros, plus interest in back taxes, saying that Ireland had given the company preferential tax treatment. The EU also filed a formal antitrust complaint against Google over its Android operating system last year. The European Union fined Google $2.7 billion, I think, or euros, I'm not sure, $2.7 billion, ruling that its preferential treatment of its own content, that is the Google shopping option, was illegal and anti-competitive. And one commentator says about this one that not only was this a very large fine, but it was also an order for Google to essentially change how it handles search. France is often seen as the benchmark for the defence of cultural patrimony in Europe, but Germany's strict requirements for Werbung, or promotional declarations for online creators, and the resolute stance of the state-authorised collecting society and Performing Rights Association, GEMA, to refuse to apply principles enshrined in the US Digital Millennium Copyright Act, safe harbour provisions, instead regarding YouTube as liable when it hosts copyrighted videos without the copyright holder's permission. So that 7-year standoff was partially resolved late last year when YouTube agreed to an undisclosed rate at which GEMA members would be remunerated for video streams. Now, we can go on. You know more about this than I do, I'm sure. But I want to contrast the situation in Europe with liberal democracies outside the Eurozone, where there's little to no track record of policy action to regulate platforms as emerging media companies. Now, I'll come to that in a minute, but of course there are many very clear models for regulation, or the lack of it, outside Europe. There's the US model, with its reluctance to regulate based on Schumpeterian, but also culturally imperialistic notions of innovation. And that secular saint of the moderate left, former President Barack Obama, called the EU actions against US platforms protectionism. I found this surprising when I came across this. Even Barack Obama, the great liberal internationalist, gets all protectionist when it comes to national champions, American national champions. So you can read that for yourself. The US regulatory model is one based on competition, innovation, and national champions. It operates on antitrust principles of competition within the US sometimes, and state support for industry outside the US. As we've known, it follows time-honoured principles established for Hollywood from the 1920s, as the great film historians Thomas Guback and Kristen Thompson have written about. This is underlined in the exquisite symmetry of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, shoring up the ability of established media hegemons to continue to extract copyright rents, while further criminalising attempts to circumvent strong copyright control on the one hand, while at the same time, through the safe harbour provisions, curating the conditions for the new generation of US digital hegemons operating on quite distinct principles of aggregation and spreadability rather than control. I mean, there's an exquisite symmetry to the DMCA. There is quite simply a fundamental Atlantic fault line with the US assessing monopoly behaviour in the context purely of consumer welfare. And when you've got platforms that are offering so many great services for free, there's a real reluctance in the US, which has otherwise a very strong history of antitrust, to go anywhere near the platforms. Now, of course, on the other hand, there's the Chinese model and the North Korean model, which are outright bans, and the model practiced by numerous Middle Eastern countries, which involves temporary bans on US platforms around elections and at other times of political and religious unrest. But as I say, for the liberal democracies outside the Eurozone, there are seen to be real difficulties regulating foreign entities and applying path-dependent regulatory models modelled on linear broadcasting. There must also be a calculus based on innovation, and the platforms' roles in that continues to be the case even as they grow very large and very vulnerable to organised gaming of their algorithm. The fact is that any regulation of social media services, as distinct from traditional film and television professional content served up by streaming services, first requires full acknowledgement of the immense day-to-day virtual real-time regulation of the platforms they do themselves. It's been estimated that there are 80 million takedown notices a month handled by Google around the world. 80 million takedown notices a month. Yes, most of them for copyright, but also hate speech, revenge porn, and all the other nasties out there. So that's got to be acknowledged first, that they are massive self-regulators already. Then an acknowledgement that any regulation must be co-regulation in the context of extremely volatile social, political and business conditions, and of course what would actually be required for regulation of those platforms technically. There are also our social media entertainment caveats based on a creator-focused approach, which cries, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. For example, the adpocalypse that occurred earlier this year saw brand safe responses, very rapid brand safety responses, that saw many minority creators demonetised overnight, particularly LGBT creators and those players of Assassin's Creed, for example, who found their gameplay completely demonetised because the word assassin was demonetised across the board. So there's some of the caveats that need to be assessed in talking about regulation of the platforms, obviously within the Eurozone, but also for those weak-kneed polities outside the Eurozone that I'm about to now talk about Australia. These issues have been played out very much currently in my country. Australia is party to a coordinated intergovernmental effort to bring the platforms, and that includes Apple, to heel on tax minimisation. And there has been prominent parliamentary inquiries supporting these policies. The politics of tax are far more important politically than screen content regulation. And so are stable independent journalism, the future of independent journalism. These two political realities are far more important in my country than content regulation, and politicians and decision makers will make decisions based on those priorities before they get around to the question of content regulation. So taking that as a realpolitik, I then want to say a few things. So in the context of the future for Australian content regulation, which is going on at the moment, you don't need to read that very much, but I want to talk about a current inquiry that I've put a significant submission to. So in the context of this review of Australian content regulations, which currently require commercial broadcasters, linear broadcasters, to meet various levels of Australian content, where does the whole platform question fit in here? Well, I consulted to Google earlier this year on this, and I worked in preparing this submission with an experienced corporate lawyer on trying to bring to bear a number of new issues into this. There's been issues. The so-called Convergence Review in 2012 came up with a sliding scale for regulation that would see Google, Apple move above that dotted line. The dotted line represents both reach and revenue, and they would become regulatable as they crossed that line, and others that as they declined and went below that line would cease to be regulated. So that was great then, not seen as very likely now. And the other thing about this is that it's all focused on so-called professional content. Now, regulation that focuses only on the streaming services misses, I think, the deeper question. If it's true, what I argue, that there's a greater content and creative challenge with social media entertainment than with more Hollywood content delivered by new means, then where does the new content, the new green shoots fit in? So our proposition, Ian McGill and I, who's a corporate lawyer, is to adopt in a careful evidence-based... How many minutes have I got? Like 1 or 2? Tell me. 5 minutes. Really? Oh, that's very nice. Thank you very much, Indrik. So our proposition is to adopt in a careful evidence-based transition away from the reliance on quotas to an incentives-based model based on the production of Australian content, which depends on a public-private funds development partnership under the umbrella of what we call an Australian Screen Content Fund. The new elements in this proposal are to attract into the screen content space a new level of involvement of funds management expertise designed to grow the pie, while also making the pie increasingly contestable, driving future-oriented, innovative content strategies which build toward a post-linear broadcast vision of broad-scale popular screen culture as it evolves over the next decade or so. The fund would have sufficient liquidity. There would be new money from government, but also diverted from existing programs, plus spectrum fees paid by broadcasters, and also new financial instruments rarely if ever used in screen culture, such as social benefit bonds and public ancillary funds. And these would be invested in a sovereign wealth model and ultimately move towards self-sufficiency. So if this fund was seen to be working well and attracting new sources of funding for Australian content, engaging new viewerships, particularly the lost generation of millennials, it would be expected that platforms and streaming services would also invest. On the principle of reciprocity on the part of larger stakeholders would be expected to contribute. So investment in the fund gives rights of access to the fund. In developing this recommendation, Ian McGill and I hoped to secure some common ground for major reform. Investment models are something that most stakeholders in these kinds of battles can agree, at least in principle, on, while more or less regulation is something very few can agree on. We look to grow the pie, to stimulate the screen production sector through access to high-quality funds management expertise, and to draw expert funds managers and creative funding methodologies into supporting the sector. The proposal is fully technology neutral and stimulates contestability and innovation. We see the synergies that could be established across the divisions, both the market failure genres that are currently the subject of subsidy, but also the new green shoots, and even the independent journalism practices. That these synergies across the divisions within the fund as highly innovative. In essence, we say, trying to attract attention, culture is too important to be left only to cultural experts. This is an opportunity for business expertise to structurally contribute to the sustainability of cultural production, rather than it be a relationship mediated mostly through philanthropy. So, how much all this roiling universe of media innovation that I've tried to traverse in these 40 minutes or so meets any of society's needs and any of your expectations of an opening address? It's now your turn to tell me. Thank you.